Love can heal, but hers could kill. Welcome to Warm Leaves. I am your host, Raven. Tell me where you're tuning in from. Your voices keep these mysteries alive. Now, let's follow the trail. The small village of Ashby-under-Lyme basked in the last light of an unusually warm spring evening. Flower beds glowed, neat hedgerows cast long shadows across cobbled lanes, and from the open windows of the vicarage drifted the gentle clinking of china and the hum of conversation. Inside, tea was served with scones and lemon curd, as it often was on Sundays. But on this particular Sunday, death had arrived quietly between one polite laugh and the next. Miss Marple had not intended to be in Ashby that weekend. Her nephew Raymond's sudden cancellation of their trip to Eastbourne left her rather free, and the vicar's wife, an old friend from their days at Cheltenham, had insisted she come and spend a few days. It was all perfectly peaceful. Until Mrs. Marston died, she was a guest at the same tea party, a stately woman of 60 with an imperious tilt to her head and pearls that seemed to outshine her smile. Mrs. Marston had been talking animatedly one moment, sipping her tea with practiced grace, and slumped in her chair the next. No cry, no choking, no drama. Just a sudden cessation of movement, the teacup slipping from her fingers and smashing on the floor. Gasps erupted. Dr. Galbraith was summoned from across the lane. The guests, the vicar, his wife, Miss Marple, Colonel Everard, and a few other notables, watched in stunned silence as the doctor gently touched her throat, then shook his head. "She's gone," he said quietly. The police arrived promptly. Inspector Craddock, who had dealt with Miss Marple before, found her knitting by the fire when he entered. "I had hoped you wouldn't be involved, Miss Marple," he said, with the faintest sigh. "I had hoped not to be, Inspector," she replied. "But death is dreadfully inconvenient that way, isn't it?" At first the cause of death was uncertain. No marks, no signs of struggle. But within a day the post-mortem revealed what no one suspected. Digitalis poisoning. A swift-acting dose. Something slipped into her tea. Suspicion fell heavily on the party guests. The tea had been poured by Mrs. Bletchley, the vicar's wife, but the cups were all identical, and Mrs. Marston had chosen hers at random. Or had she? "No fingerprints on the cup fragments," Craddock muttered, flipping through his notebook. "No prints on the teapot either. Everyone touched everything. A jumbled mess." There were 8 people present at that tea. Mrs. Bletchley, the vicar, Dr. Galbraith, Colonel Everard, a local schoolteacher, Miss Withers, Mr. Perry, a quiet man from the village council, Miss Marple, and of course the deceased. No one had seen anything suspicious. No strange behavior, no fumbling with cups, no odd smells or colors. And the digitalis extracted from foxglove, said the doctor, could only have been added to her cup, as no one else showed any symptoms. "But why her?" asked the inspector. "She wasn't rich, wasn't particularly liked, but not hated. Either. No known enemies." Miss Marple, silent through most of the questioning, sat thoughtfully, her eyes occasionally scanning the others, as though watching a play unfold. She was rather insistent about having that particular cup. She said finally, "What?" Craddock turned. She dropped her napkin, and when she returned to the table, she switched cups. She said it was hers, but I'm quite sure it wasn't. I noticed because she brushed my arm reaching for it. People rarely pay attention to small things, but sometimes they matter. Craddock looked at her sharply. "So you think the cup was intended for someone else?" "It's a possibility," Miss Marple replied mildly. But then came the stranger detail, the misleading clue that threw the entire investigation off course. In Mrs. Marston's handbag, tucked into a side pocket, was a pressed flower. A dried foxglove blossom, brittle and ancient. It was impossible to say when it had been placed there. It could have been a bizarre calling card, or a coincidence. "She may have put it there herself," Craddock said. "Sentimental trinket." "Or see," Miss Marple countered gently. "Someone wanted us to think it was about the foxglove, as though it were obvious. Sometimes, dear Inspector, the most obvious clue is the most misleading." Rumors began to circulate. Old stories about Mrs. Marston's late husband resurfaced. He had died mysteriously some 15 years ago. Heart failure, they said. But there had been whispers even then. She'd lived comfortably off his estate ever since. Then there was the matter of a new will, one Mrs. Marston had supposedly drawn up the week before her death, cutting out her niece in favour of a local charity. But no will was found. Miss Marple, meanwhile, visited the Marston cottage. It was small but tasteful, a bit neglected. She spent nearly an hour in the late woman's bedroom, studying the books on the shelves, the locked drawer in the writing desk, the faded photographs. When she returned, her expression was thoughtful, her steps brisk. The investigation dragged for 2 more days. The villagers speculated wildly. No new evidence surfaced. Then, on Thursday, a second death occurred. Colonel Everard, robust and healthy, was found dead in his garden shed. Another digitalis poisoning, but this time the teacup was found beside him, as though he had taken his own life. The note left behind was brief. "I never meant to harm her. It was a mistake. I deserve this." Craddock declared the case closed. Murder-suicide, motive possibly an affair or revenge. The colonel had served with Mr. Marston long ago. Perhaps a grudge had festered. Miss Marple, however, did not look satisfied. "If he had meant to poison Mrs. Marston," she said quietly, "why leave such a vague note? Why not confess outright?" Craddock shrugged. "Remorse makes men vague. Or someone wanted it to look like remorse," Miss Marple replied. "Someone very clever, and quite patient." She asked for access to the teacups again. A fresh idea had occurred to her, something she'd seen long ago in another village, tiny scratches on porcelain, imperceptible unless you held it to the light just so. Only one cup had such a mark. "Acid," she said softly, "to score the inside. The cup would slowly leak if filled just long enough. The poison must have been hidden underneath the saucer, activated when the hot tea was poured." Craddock stared at her. "And who," she asked, "would have known? How to time it precisely? To orchestrate the random selection of that cup? And who had access to foxglove and a locked drawer where a missing will might be hidden?" Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Miss Withers?" Miss Marple nodded once. She was the only one who didn't react with shock. She waited, watching. And she was seen leaving the Marston cottage last week under the pretense of delivering books for the Women's Guild. But she had keys, a duplicate set, made when she was Mrs. Marston's companion last year. That will, hidden in the locked drawer, named the niece as heir, not the charity. "And the foxglove in the handbag?" Craddock asked, breathless. "A red herring," Miss Marple said, "or rather a purple one. Miss Withers was arrested that evening. In the drawer of her desk were dried foxglove leaves, an engraving tool used to etch the cup, and the missing will. As she was led away, she said only, 'She wasn't supposed to take that cup.'" Miss Marple folded her knitting and sighed. "In the end," she said, "hearts are not only poisoned by digitalis, envy does just as well." The quiet of Ashby-under-Lyme was deceptive in the days that followed Miss Withers' arrest. The sun continued to rise gently over the hills, the birds still chattered in the hedgerows, and the vicar's garden remained in bloom, but underneath the surface, tension lingered like a cough in the throat of the village. For all that the arrest of Miss Withers had seemingly closed the case, there were murmurs, uncertainties shared in hushed tones at shop counters and between neighbours over fences. Some said she didn't look like a murderer, others pointed to her calm demeanour and said that's what made her dangerous. Miss Marple stayed on at the vicarage, ostensibly to rest before returning to St. Mary Mead. But she rarely sat idle. Instead, she resumed her daily walks through the village, pausing often to speak to those she passed. Never prying, never pressing, but always observing. Inspector Craddock, meanwhile, had returned to the station with a report almost ready for submission. The evidence was clear. Motive, method, and opportunity all led to Miss Withers. But something sat uneasily with him, something he couldn't quite name. "Funny thing," he mentioned one morning while sharing tea with Miss Marple, "I can't stop thinking about Colonel Everard's note. Doesn't feel like him. The man wrote reports during the war that were as dry and exact as a ledger, and yet the note he leaves behind is vague to the point of nonsense." Miss Marple looked up from her embroidery. "Perhaps because he didn't write it." Craddock gave her a sharp glance. "You still think the wrong person's in the dock?" She didn't answer directly. "Tell me, Inspector, what do you know of Mr. Perry?" "Perry?" Craddock frowned. Quiet chap. Sits on the council. Keeps bees. I believe. He was at the tea but didn't say much. No connection to the victim that we could find. And yet he seemed very interested in the teacups. Craddock blinked. How do you mean? After Mrs. Marston died, he was the one who collected the broken cup pieces. Said he wanted to help clear up, but I remember very clearly that he picked up the shards with his bare hands, despite everyone being told not to touch anything. And when the police arrived, those shards were already wrapped in a napkin. That struck me as premature. Craddock stood. Why didn't you say this earlier? I wasn't certain it meant anything at the time, and well, a lady must be careful about appearing meddlesome. She smiled, but Craddock was already out the door. Later that day, he called at Mr. Perry's cottage, finding the man pruning his rose bushes. A slight fellow with watery eyes and a hesitant manner, Perry seemed surprised to see the inspector. Just tying up a few threads, Craddock said with deceptive ease. Would you mind if I asked a few questions about the tea party? Perry wiped his hands nervously. Of course, but I really don't know anything more than I said. Quite. Though I did wonder what made you pick up the broken cup. Didn't you worry about disturbing evidence? Perry hesitated, visibly caught. Well, I didn't think. Reflex, I suppose. It was just lying there. Craddock nodded, watching him closely. And you'd never been in Mrs. Marston's house before? No, never, not once. Later, when he reported the exchange to Miss Marple, she tilted her head slightly. He lied. Craddock narrowed his eyes. You're sure? Quite. When I visited the Marston cottage, I saw a book in her parlour on apiculture, beekeeping, inscribed, "To Marjorie from Harold, for your new garden. May your flowers and bees prosper together." That's Mr. Perry's first name, isn't it? Craddock's jaw tightened. So he had been to her house, possibly more than once. And bees, Miss Marple continued softly, have certain botanical needs. Foxglove, while beautiful, is quite dangerous to them. An experienced keeper would never plant it in large numbers near hives. But he has it in his garden, Craddock muttered, already reaching for his coat. They returned to Perry's cottage, an hour later with a quiet warrant in hand. The search was meticulous, and in the shed behind the house, among racks of gardening tools and bee boxes, they found a leather-bound journal. Inside, in a precise hand, were notes. Dozens of them. Detailed observations of Mrs. Marston's routines, her habits, her moods, her changes in behavior over the past year. There were even clipped letters, little notes in her handwriting, polite refusals and stiff replies, and a pressed foxglove. He was in love with her, Craddock murmured, obsessed more like. Miss Marple turned a page, and spurned. They found more than that. Hidden in a drawer was an envelope containing a photocopy of Mrs. Marston's old will, the one that left her estate to her niece, the very will that had mysteriously vanished. It was dated and marked as witnessed by Perry and Miss Withers, nearly a year ago. Miss Marple tapped the page gently. That's the key, you know. He witnessed the will and realized what was at stake. Perhaps he thought she would change it again, to name him even. But when she didn't, she became an obstacle. Craddock finished grimly. Miss Withers' involvement became clearer. It seemed Perry had manipulated her into believing something was amiss, encouraged her to check on Mrs. Marston's affairs, subtly seeding doubt and jealousy. But he'd kept the real will, ensuring its disappearance. And then there was the tea. He must have known the poisoned cup was marked, Craddock said, his voice low. Switched it when no one was looking, made sure it landed near her, but then she changed her mind and picked a different one. Miss Marple nodded, and he panicked. That's why Colonel Everard died, to tie up the loose end, to make sure someone else took the blame. A second poisoning, Craddock murmured, to sell the lie. That evening the village trembled once again as Mr. Perry was taken into custody. He did not resist. He only looked at Miss Marple as he passed, and something in his eyes, a pleading softness, a bitter kind of resignation, spoke not of violence, but of deep, hopeless sorrow. He said nothing during the interrogation, only nodded when shown her journal. When asked why at last, he replied quietly, "I waited for her to see me, to see what we could be, but she saw nothing at all." Miss Marple stood alone in the garden that night, the scent of foxglove drifting on the breeze. "Some hearts," she murmured, "are poisoned long before the first drop is poured." The drawing room of the vicarage had become, by quiet consensus, the unofficial centre of the investigation. The villagers would never say so openly, but they found a strange comfort in seeing Miss Marple seated by the fireplace, knitting in hand, her eyes bright beneath the soft droop of white hair. Inspector Craddock returned each day, notebooks in hand, and the two would quietly discuss the unfolding truths between cups of tea and the rustle of wool. Now that Mr. Perry sat behind bars, the case seemed nearly resolved. But Miss Marple remained unsatisfied, and Craddock could feel it too, like a faint draught under a closed door, an unresolved current in an otherwise still house. It was time, they agreed, to speak again with each of the tea-party guests. Not as suspects, perhaps, but as witnesses to the subtle threads that still needed unpicking. Colonel Everard was gone, Miss Withers was under review, and Perry had confessed. But still the atmosphere at the tea had been thick with something more. Some other deception had passed unnoticed in the shadows of the larger crime. Mrs. Bletchley, the vicar's wife, was the first to return. She sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes darting to Miss Marple's face, and then quickly, away. Her voice was polite, careful. "I do hope I didn't contribute to anything," she murmured. "It's all been such a frightful shock." Miss Marple smiled gently. "You poured the tea, didn't you, dear?" "Yes, but the cups were all clean. I checked them myself." "I always do." Craddock tilted his head. "Do you remember who picked up which cup?" Mrs. Bletchley frowned. "Well, no, I didn't pay close attention. They were just there, you see, arranged on the tray. I suppose Mrs. Marston was the last to take one, but I can't say for certain which." A small pause. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "You seemed very quick to suggest Miss Withers might have reason to resent Mrs. Marston when we spoke the first time," she said lightly. Mrs. Bletchley blushed. "Did I? I only meant she was rather well watchful, wasn't she? Always writing in her little notebook, always noticing things. I thought it odd is all." "Noticing things," Craddock repeated. "That's something she and you have. In common, I imagine?" The vicar's wife gave a brittle laugh. "I'm hardly a sleuth, Inspector." And yet she had seen more than she let on. Both detectives sensed it. Not lies, exactly. Just omissions. The kind that let the truth slip away unseen. Next came Miss Withers herself, escorted from the temporary holding house. She sat primly, hands still, eyes steady. Resentment radiated from her, not loud or aggressive, but sharp and cold, like the wind before a storm. "I should never have trusted Harold," she said simply. "You mean Mr. Perry?" Craddock asked. She nodded. "He was always around the Marston place. He told me she had no intention of leaving anything to her niece, that she planned to leave it all to some obscure charity. I believed him. And yet, you helped her draft." "The will," Miss Marple observed. "The original one?" "Yes, months ago. But then she said she'd changed her mind again, that she had drawn up a new version, with her solicitor. I never saw it. I suppose she didn't want me involved anymore." Miss Marple watched her over the rim of her teacup. "Were you angry?" Miss Withers looked away. "Yes," she said after a pause, "but not enough to kill her. Yet when she died, you said nothing about the will. You didn't even mention Perry's involvement until we found your name on the witness line. I was afraid," she whispered. "Afraid I'd be blamed." Craddock leaned back. "You were, to be fair, very nearly right." They released her later that evening, but Miss Marple could see it plainly in her eyes. Miss Withers knew more. Not about the murder, perhaps, but about the motives swirling around the tea table that day. She was afraid, yes, but also ashamed. Mr. Perry's confession had come too easily. It explained everything neatly, too neatly, as though designed to shield something else from view. Next was the vicar himself, Reverend Bletchley, a kindly man with thinning hair and ink-stained cuffs. He seemed baffled by it all. "I can't say I noticed much," he said apologetically. "I remember Mrs. Marston seemed a little tense that afternoon. She asked to speak with me privately just before the party, but we were interrupted." "Did she say what it was about?" Craddock asked. The vicar hesitated. only that it concerned her niece. I believe she was having second thoughts about the new will." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "You're sure she said new will?" "Yes, she was quite clear. I assumed she meant to restore her niece as heir. That detail was telling. If Marston had planned to undo her charitable bequest, then perhaps someone else had a motive, someone who wanted that donation to go through." Craddock murmured, "We need to speak to the solicitor." When Mr. Penworthy, the solicitor in question, arrived 2 days later with the original copy of the final will, unsigned, tucked into a folder in his briefcase, the tension in the room rose. "She requested the draft, yes," he said, "but never returned it. She called the day before her death, said she needed more time to consider." "Time she didn't get," Craddock said grimly, and then came Miss Withers again, this time uninvited. She stood in the doorway, holding a thin envelope in her hand. "I found this," she said, "in the back of the poetry book Mrs. Marston lent me a week before she died. I hadn't opened it until now." Inside was a letter, a short one. "To whom it may concern. If anything should happen to me, know that I suspect someone intends to hasten my death. I have told no one, but I am not foolish. I've changed my mind about the will. I intend to see my niece tomorrow. It was unsigned, but in Mrs. Marston's hand." The date was the evening before the tea party. Miss Marple took a long breath. She knew, she said softly. She may not have known who, but she knew someone was circling. Craddock looked up. "So who was it?" "The one who stood to benefit the most if her charitable will remained in place," Miss Marple said. "Not Perry. He was a desperate man, yes, but not careful. This was someone who arranged things, subtle, calculated." Her eyes fell on the name of the charity, a fund managed locally, administered by someone well-liked, trusted. Miss Marple folded the letter slowly. "The person we haven't questioned properly at all," she said, rising. "The one who encouraged Mrs. Marston to be generous, who recommended the very fund she named in her will." Craddock's breath caught. "I don't mean—" "I do," Miss Marple said grimly. "It's time we had a word with Mr. Giles Pomeroy, the banker." And in her voice was the quiet certainty of a woman who had seen it all before. The case wasn't over, not yet. The real deception had only begun to speak. The sun had slipped behind a bank of clouds, casting a grey pall over Ashby-under-Lyme. As Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock made their way to the modest building that housed the offices of Giles Pomeroy & Co., the village's most respectable, if only, financial advisory service, Mr. Pomeroy himself met them in the front room, a round man in a brown suit with an affable smile and a nervous way of adjusting his cufflinks. "Inspector, Miss Marple." "What?" "An unexpected surprise," he said, his voice breezy. "Do come in. I hope this isn't about poor Mrs. Marston, a dreadful business?" "On the contrary," Craddock replied, "this is very much about Mrs. Marston. We've just come from the solicitor, Mr. Penworthy." Mr. Pomeroy's expression didn't change, but his eyes flicked toward the closed inner office door. "Ah, I see. Well then, please take a seat." Inside, the atmosphere changed. It was quieter, more controlled, with ledgers stacked neatly and a faint scent of tobacco and lemon polish. Mr. Pomeroy sat behind his desk, steepling his fingers. "I understand you encouraged Mrs. Marston to consider a charitable donation sum." "Months ago," Miss Marple began gently. "Encouraged?" he repeated. "No, not exactly. She inquired about local trusts and I gave her a list. That's all. I'm a financial advisor, Miss Marple. I advise." "And one of those was the Ashby Village Improvement Fund," Craddock said. "Yes, quite. A very modest, entirely above board initiative. We assist with repairs to the church roof, sponsor youth programs. Nothing extravagant. Yet it was this very charity that stood to inherit the majority of her estate under the new will," Miss Marple murmured. Pomeroy smiled, tightly. "Pure coincidence." "Coincidences," she said, "are rather rare in murder cases." There was a silence. Then Craddock asked, "Did you know Mrs. Marston intended to change her will again, reinstating her niece as heir?" Pomeroy blinked. "No, I wasn't aware." Miss Marple observed the faint twitch in his cheek, the way his fingers tightened on the desk edge. "You see," she continued, "if that will had been signed, the improvement fund would have received nothing. And I believe you personally oversaw its finances, yes?" Among others, he replied cautiously. I'm treasurer, yes. And the fund was under audit 2 years ago, was it not? A small discrepancy, nothing formal, but enough to raise a few quiet eyebrows. Pomeroy's affability cracked slightly. Are you accusing me of something, Miss Marple? Not at all, she said sweetly, merely pointing out how very inconvenient it would be if a generous donation slipped through your fingers at the last moment. Craddock stood. We'll need to see the fund's financial records, Mr. Pomeroy. All of them. As they left the office, Craddock leaned in. Do you think he did it? I think, Miss Marple said, that we have several suspects, each with a motive strong enough to kill, and only one truth that can make sense of all their contradictions. It was time to lay the maze out clearly. That evening, she and Craddock gathered their notes. They reviewed every known player, mapping motives and alibis on sheets of paper spread across the vicarage's long dining table. Miss Withers, dismissed as a bitter spinster with wounded pride, had opportunity and motive, but not the means. She had access to the Marston home, yes, but not the knowledge to engineer such a precise poisoning. Colonel Everard, now dead, had left a false confession, a decoy. He had once served with Marston's late husband. Possibly he knew something, but his presence at the tea had always seemed tense. Had he suspected something himself? Harold Perry, the beekeeper, obsessed and rejected. He had confessed, yes. But Miss Marple had long learned that those who confess too quickly are often shielding something or someone. Mrs. Bletchley, the vicar's wife, had seen more than she claimed. Her discomfort during questioning suggested more than just social anxiety. But what did she stand to gain? And now Giles Pomeroy, a man with motive, means, and a financial reason to ensure the will never changed again. Miss Marple tapped her, knitting needles against the table. We're approaching this as though there's one murderer, she said softly. But perhaps this was not the work of a lone hand. Craddock looked up sharply. You mean a conspiracy? Of sorts, more likely. Layers. One act triggering another. One crime nesting inside a second like Russian dolls. She returned to the question that had lingered since the beginning. Why had Colonel Everard been killed? He had not been central to the inheritance. He had no financial stake, and yet he'd been silenced deliberately. Perhaps, she said slowly, he knew something. Perhaps he recognized something at the tea party. A behavior, a pattern. She recalled a moment, subtle, easily missed. When Mrs. Marston had taken her cup, Everard's eyes had followed her hand with unmistakable intensity. He knew something about the cup. What if he had seen someone tampering with it? Craddock, she said suddenly, do you remember what Mr. Perry said in his confession? Only that he'd meant to poison her and that he'd panicked when she switched cups. But what if that part was a lie? What if he didn't poison the cup at all? What if he only found out someone else had and feared being blamed? Craddock paled. Then Colonel Everard's death wasn't about silencing a killer. It was about silencing a witness. Perry's obsession had made him vulnerable. But it was someone else, someone cleverer, bolder, who had taken advantage of that. Miss Marple glanced back at Pomeroy's name on the list. He had motive, but he didn't attend the tea. Unless, she murmured, he did attend, uninvited. Unseen. She rose from her chair and stepped to the hallway. I need to speak to Dora. Who's Dora? Craddock asked, following. The maid who set the tea tray, Mrs. Bletchley's housemaid. Dora, a shy young girl of 17, answered nervously, wiping her hands on her apron. Dora, dear, Miss Marple said kindly. On the day of the tea, did anyone come into the kitchen before the guests arrived? Dora blinked. Yes'm, a man came to speak with Mrs. Bletchley. Said he had a question about a church donation. I didn't catch his name. Miss Marple nodded. Did he go near the tea things? I think so. I'd just laid out the cups. Could you describe him? Dora hesitated. Round fellow, red face, brown suit. Miss Marple smiled. Thank you, dear, that's very helpful. When she returned to the sitting room, Craddock was waiting. Well, it was Pomeroy, she said. He tampered with the cup before it ever left the kitchen. Mrs. Bletchley assumed the tray was untouched, but it wasn't. And then, When he saw that Mrs. Marston planned to change her will, he acted fast. Colonel Everard recognized him, probably confronted him privately, and paid the price. Miss Marple finished. The maze had closed. Each suspect had touched part of the crime, but only Pomeroy had orchestrated its center. The next morning, Craddock returned to Pomeroy's office with a warrant. As he was led away in handcuffs, the banker whispered hoarsely, "She wasn't supposed to drink it, not really. I just wanted her to wait, delay the change. I didn't mean to." But the damage had long been done. In Ashby-under-Lyme, the truth finally settled over the village like dust after a storm, and Miss Marple, returning to her seat by the vicarage fire, resumed her knitting without missing a stitch. "Crimes," she said softly, "are never truly solved by evidence alone. It's the hearts behind them one must read. And some hearts," she added, "are far better at lying than their owners." Rain fell in a light drizzle over Ashby-under-Lyme, softening the edges of the cobbled streets and muting the usual hum of village life. Though the banker Giles Pomeroy had been taken into custody just 2 days earlier, the village had already begun to exhale, slowly, cautiously, believing the affair now concluded. In the parlors and shops, whispers turned to relief. Inspector Craddock was halfway through writing his final report. The evidence, after all, was sound. Pomeroy had been placed at the scene, unseen in the kitchen before the tea was served. The motive was obvious: the diverted inheritance. The means, poison in the teacup, now understood. And a confession of sorts had been wrung from him, albeit muddled and tinged with regret. But Miss Marple, sitting quietly by the fire in the vicarage, did not resume her knitting. She watched the rain slip down the window pane with the same keen expression she had worn since the moment she'd seen Dora, the maid, trembling in the hallway. There was something wrong. Not with the evidence. It was tidy, even elegant. But tidy, Miss Marple had learned, was not always true. She turned to Craddock as he entered the room, shaking his umbrella. "You've written your report?" "Nearly finished," he said, setting his satchel down. "Pomeroy's being transferred to Basingstoke tomorrow. The village solicitor is preparing charges. I must admit, Jane, I didn't think you'd solve this one so neatly." Miss Marple gave him a long, thoughtful look. "Do you think it is solved?" Craddock frowned. "Isn't it?" She hesitated. "Let me ask you this. When Pomeroy tampered with the teacup, what was his plan?" Craddock blinked. "To delay the will, wasn't it?" "You said so yourself." "Yes, delay, not kill." She rose and moved to the fireplace. "But if he merely meant to frighten Mrs. Marston, why use a fatal dose? Why not something that made her ill, barely?" Craddock looked puzzled. "Perhaps he panicked, miscalculated." Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "A banker with a head for numbers miscalculating dosage? I think not." Craddock shifted uncomfortably. "You think he was framed?" "No," she said. "I think he played a part, but not the central one. He acted, yes, but someone else ensured the poison reached its mark. Someone more precise, someone who wanted her dead, not just frightened." There was a long silence. Then Craddock said, "We should speak to Dora again." But Dora was gone. Her bed had not been slept in, her small satchel of clothes missing, and from the vicar's pantry, an empty jar of honey was found on the floor. A strange thing to take. "She was afraid," Miss Marple said softly, holding the sticky lid between her fingers. "Afraid of what she saw or did." A note had been left in the garden shed, crumpled and half torn. "I didn't know what he gave me. I just did as he said. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. It wasn't signed, but it was enough." Craddock was on the telephone for an hour after that, alerting stations across Hampshire. A search was ordered, though Miss Marple suspected Dora had already boarded a coach. She would not get far, not in this weather and not alone, but the damage had been done. "It changes everything," Craddock muttered that evening, pacing the vicarage floor. "If Dora administered the poison unknowingly, someone else orchestrated it. Which means Pomeroy might have been manipulated." "Or threatened," Miss Marple added. "Remember, he didn't confess to the murder, only to tampering with the teacups. There's a difference. But who else could have—" She raised a hand. "Let's walk through it again." And so they did. Mrs. Marston had changed her will. That much was true. The new version would have disinherited the improvement fund which Pomeroy controlled. He had every reason to act, and he had visited the vicarage kitchen before the tea. That part was real, but Dora, frightened and naive, had clearly been used. She hadn't poisoned the cup of her own accord. She wouldn't have known what she was handling. She was given the vial, Miss Marple said, told it was medicine, or flavouring, perhaps even told it would calm Mrs. Marston's nerves, and she did as instructed. Craddock exhaled. So Pomeroy's role was a red herring. More like a layer, she said. The true killer used his guilt to shield themselves. They allowed his mistake to hide a greater one. And you think they're still here? She nodded, waiting, watching, believing they've gotten away with it. Craddock rubbed his face. So we start over. Not quite, Miss Marple said. We follow the thread we missed. That night she reviewed the guest list again. Not the central suspects, Miss Withers, Perry, Pomeroy, but the ones who'd been overlooked, the quiet ones, the peripheral figures who moved unseen. She thought of Mr. Perry's journal, filled with notes about Mrs. Marston's habits. One entry had stood out at the time, but now shimmered with new meaning. She no longer trusts her niece, said something about the girl becoming like her father. That phrase, so easily dismissed, had lodged in Miss Marple's mind. Becoming like her father. Who was the niece? No one had spoken to her directly, not Craddock, not the village. The inheritance had been hers, then taken away, then restored, then threatened again. Miss Marple reached for the village directory. The niece Lillian Westcombe lived 3 parishes away. She had been due to visit the week after the murder. She never arrived. A quick call to the parish priest confirmed that Miss Westcombe had left the village days before Mrs. Marston's death. To make peace with her aunt, she had said, but no one had seen her arrive in Ashby, and no one had confirmed that she hadn't. Miss Marple turned to Craddock. We need to look again at the tea party. Every guest? No, she said. Every servant. Dora had set the tray. But who carried it out? Who served the guests? Mrs. Bletchley's maid was known to have a cough that week. She hadn't been seen, but a temporary girl had arrived just before the gathering, quiet, unassuming, and conveniently forgettable. Miss Marple recalled the face now. The soft brown hair, the wide blue eyes, not Dora's, and the realization struck her like a jolt. It wasn't Dora in the kitchen, she said aloud. It was someone pretending to be her. Craddock stared. You think... I think Lillian Westcombe arrived 3 days early, Miss Marple said grimly, and disguised herself to get close. She knew her aunt had changed the will. She knew Pomeroy might act. She simply nudged it all along and ensured the cup did go to her aunt. 2 poisoners, Craddock said slowly. 1 accidental, 1 deliberate, and 1 still in the shadows, Miss Marple finished. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. But inside the vicarage, the storm had only just begun. The next morning dawned with a brittle stillness, the kind that settles over a village not yet ready to face a darker truth. Though Giles Pomeroy remained in custody, the atmosphere in Ashby-under-Lyme had shifted once more, from fragile relief to a new uncertain tension, and Miss Marple, perched in the vicar's study with her teacup untouched, felt the unmistakable hum of old ghosts rising from their graves. I don't think this began last week, she said quietly to Inspector Craddock. I think we're staring at the end of something that started years ago. Craddock, though tired and exasperated from chasing the vanished Dora across 3 counties, leaned forward. What makes you say that? Miss Marple tapped a slim file she'd asked him to retrieve from the county archives. It was an incident from 1931, faded and brittle with age, marked Marston Estate, trespass. I remember this, she said. It caused quite a stir, though it was quickly hushed. A labourer was attacked near the Marston greenhouse. There were whispers of a scandal involving a housemaid. Mrs. Marston buried the affair under charity, work and moral posturing, but some wounds don't heal just because they're ignored. Craddock opened the file. The name of the injured party, Joseph Westcombe. Miss Marple nodded. Lillian's father. Craddock's eyes narrowed. That's impossible. Mrs. Marston always insisted she raised her niece out of duty. That, her sister had died young. She never mentioned a scandal. Because it was a scandal, Miss Marple replied. Joseph Westcombe wasn't just a drunken gardener who got into a scuffle. He was the man Mrs. Marston's younger sister fell in love with. They ran off together, married in disgrace. Her sister never returned. When she died, Mrs. Marston took the child in out of obligation, but never let her forget the shame. Craddock flipped the page. It says Joseph tried to see Lillian, was found trespassing, claimed he'd been denied contact. That's when the altercation happened. Miss Marple looked into the fire. And not long after, Joseph Westcombe disappeared. His body was never found. Craddock exhaled slowly. You're saying Lillian believed Mrs. Marston had him killed? I think, Miss Marple said, that she believed her father died for loving the wrong woman, and that her aunt profited off that silence. Craddock rose, pacing. So this wasn't just revenge for a rewritten will. This was a vendetta, years in the making. Lillian didn't want the inheritance, Miss Marple said. She wanted justice, or something like it. But her method was patient. She waited for someone else to act first. Pomeroy gave her that opening. Craddock tapped the file. But how do we prove this? Lillian's vanished. Dora's fled. Pomeroy's barely speaking. Not everyone forgets, Miss Marple said, eyes glinting. We need to speak to Mrs. Bletchley. The old gossip. The very one. An hour later, the pair sat in the cluttered drawing-room of the talkative Mrs. Bletchley, who had already prepared sherry and set out her biscuit tin with suspicious speed. Oh, I knew there was something wrong at the vicarage, she said, pouring generously. That girl, Dora, she was never quite herself last week. But you're not here about her, are you? You're here about Lillian. Miss Marple leaned forward. You remember her? Mrs. Bletchley sniffed. Of course I do, lovely child, always quiet. Stayed mostly to herself, but that aunt of hers, well, Stern doesn't begin to cover it. I once heard Mrs. Marston call her tainted blood, and that was in church. Craddock grimaced. Did Lillian ever talk about her father? Oh yes, Mrs. Bletchley said. Worshipped him. Said he used to build her toy windmills out of scrap wood. After he vanished, she kept one of them on her dresser for years. But then one day it was gone, thrown out. I think Mrs. Marston made her burn it. Do you know who Lillian might have confided in? Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Bletchley considered. Well, there was Perry, the young curate. Craddock's eyebrows rose. The new one? Not so new, she said. He grew up in the village, you know, Lillian's age. They used to walk together before he left for seminary. Miss Marple and Craddock exchanged a glance. Perry, the quiet, well-meaning curate who had led the prayer at Mrs. Marston's memorial, who had spoken of her strength and sacrifice without once mentioning her cruelty. Back at the vicarage, they found Perry in his quarters, the door slightly ajar. He was writing a sermon, pen scratching slowly across the paper. You knew, Miss Marple said without preamble. Perry looked up. About Lillian? Yes. Craddock stepped forward. She was here that day, disguised as a maid. Yes. Why didn't you say anything? Perry laid down his pen with deliberate care. Because I knew what she'd endured, what Mrs. Marston had done to her parents, and because I thought I could stop her. Miss Marple sat across from him. Did you know about the poison? No, he said quickly. She told me she was coming to speak with her aunt, to confront her, not to kill her. She asked me not to say anything. She swore she only wanted the truth. Craddock crossed his arms. And when Mrs. Marston turned up dead, I thought, Perry faltered, I thought she'd lost control, or that someone else, Pomeroy, had done it before she arrived. I couldn't be sure. And when Dora ran, you tried to protect. Them both, Miss Marple said gently. Perry bowed his head. You still have feelings for her, she added. A long silence followed. Then Perry reached into his drawer and placed a small wooden windmill on the table. She left this for me, he said quietly. Said it was all she wanted from the estate, that and peace. Miss Marple took the delicate toy in her hand. It was hand-carved, simple, worn by time. Craddock looked at her. So now what? We find her, Miss Marple said, before she disappears forever. Because this isn't just about justice anymore. It's about ending something that began, long before any of us were ready to see it. And outside, the wind stirred the trees of Ashby-under-Lyme, rustling leaves that had waited too long to fall. Miss Marple sat quietly in the vicar's parlour, the delicate wooden windmill still in sight. Her hand. It was late afternoon, and the light filtering through the lace curtains painted long shadows across the worn rug. The village was growing quieter now, the initial drama faded, but the truth still remained elusive, half-glimpsed, always shifting. Inspector Craddock stood at the window, arms crossed. We've got no murder weapon, no confession, and 3 suspects who've all vanished at some point during the investigation. This case is beginning to feel like smoke and mirrors. Which, Miss Marple said gently, is precisely why we must stop looking for what is obvious and consider what is odd. Craddock glanced at her. Odd? She nodded. There's always something, some small detail that doesn't quite fit, and yet no one questions it because it seems trivial. Craddock sighed, rubbing his temple. We've reviewed the timelines, the guests, the servants. Dora fled. Lillian vanished. Pomeroy confessed to something, but I doubt even he knows what. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Exactly. We've allowed the suspects to drive the narrative. But perhaps it's time we write the narrative ourselves and see how they respond to it. Craddock turned slowly. You're proposing a trap. Not a trap, she said mildly. A test of honesty, of character, a way to poke gently at their masks and see who flinches. She rose and moved to the side table, where the Marston family photograph still stood. Mrs. Marston, upright and severe, a teenage Lillian beside her, posture stiff, and in the background, barely visible, stood Giles Pomeroy, wearing a bow tie. Miss Marple tapped the frame. Tell me, Inspector, when Pomeroy was arrested, was he wearing a bow tie? Craddock frowned. No, just a plain collar. Why? Because he always wore one, she replied. In every photo, at every public event. Always the same style, dark red, but not on the day of the murder. That's not just wardrobe. That's habit breaking down. Craddock narrowed his eyes. He was sweating when we questioned him, nervous, not quite guilty, though. Exactly, Miss Marple said. What if we give him something to respond to? Something wrong, but just believable enough to make him correct us. A few hours later, Craddock returned to the station, where Pomeroy sat slumped in the interview room. His hands were clasped. Tightly together, the air of arrogance long faded. We found the poison, Craddock said flatly. It was hidden in the tea caddy. Bit careless, wasn't it? Pomeroy blinked. Tea caddy? Miss Marple, seated just behind the glass, leaned forward slightly. Yes, Craddock said. Your fingerprints were on the tin, same one the maid used to make Mrs. Marston's tea. Pomeroy hesitated. No, that can't be. I never touched... Craddock tilted his head. You were in the kitchen, weren't you? You said you came in through the back when you arrived. I did, but... Pomeroy frowned. I didn't touch the caddy, I remember that. I made a point of it. I boiled water, yes, but I didn't open anything. I didn't want anyone to say I'd tampered with food or... He stopped. Craddock folded his arms. Interesting what you do remember. Pomeroy looked up, pale. You're lying, there's no tea caddy. You're bluffing, Miss Marple smiled behind the glass. A small crack, but a telling one. Afterward, Craddock joined her in the hallway. He took the bait, she nodded. And more importantly, he corrected your story. That wasn't guilt. That was fear of implication. He didn't poison her, but he knows someone did. Craddock crossed his arms. We need more. A crack's not a confession. Then let's try a different tactic. The next morning she visited the church under the pretense of inspecting floral arrangements. But really, she came to speak with Perry, the curate with the quiet eyes and the conscience that trembled under weight. He greeted her with kindness, offering tea she didn't drink and asking after her roses. I imagine your sermons are difficult to write these days, she said gently. Perry looked away. I try to keep them truthful. That's all one can do. And yet, she said, truth is a heavy thing, isn't it? Especially when it brushes against loyalty. Perry didn't respond. Miss Marple continued, voice soft. I've always found it fascinating how a clergyman is trusted with confessions others dare not speak aloud. You must carry so many secrets. He looked at her sharply then. I wonder, she mused aloud, if someone came to you, someone like Lillian, and told you the real story. Not just anger or grief, but the moment when she chose not to poison her aunt. When she stood there with the vial and decided she couldn't do it. Perry swallowed. She wanted justice, Miss Marple said, but perhaps she found forgiveness instead, and she told you, left you holding the secret. His voice was hoarse. She didn't do it. Miss Marple nodded once. Then who did? He looked at her and then whispered, Dora. The name fell like a stone. Perry continued. It was supposed to be a warning, a sleeping draft, nothing lethal. Lillian was going to confront her the next morning, finally tell her what she knew. But Dora, she panicked. She changed the dosage. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. Why? Because she was in love with Lillian, had been for years. And she saw the chance to end Lillian's suffering. She thought, if the aunt were gone, he rubbed his eyes. But it wasn't right. Lillian left that night. She didn't even know Mrs. Marston was dead until days later. Miss Marple rose slowly. You have to tell the inspector. Perry nodded. She'll deny it, but maybe she'll come back. Miss Marple turned to the door. She will, because the truth has a peculiar way of chasing even those who run the fastest. Outside, the air was crisp and clear. She paused, taking in the stillness of the village. Once more. Ashby-under-Lyme had always looked like a place without secrets, but sometimes it was in the most peaceful gardens where the thorns cut deepest. Rain drizzled over Ashby-under-Lyme the next morning, veiling the village in a damp hush. At the police station, Inspector Craddock hunched over a growing stack of files, the case feeling heavier now than ever. Dora Merriweather had returned in the early hours, escorted by an anonymous tip from a phone box outside Duxford. She was silent through questioning, expression blank as if the soul had been drained from her. Miss Marple sat quietly nearby, knitting in her lap, her eyes never truly focused on the yarn. Her mind worked behind her pleasant expression, connecting. Threads not of wool but of people, lies and choices. She said nothing, she asked, not looking up. Not a word, Craddock muttered. No confession, no denial, just a blank refusal to speak. We've nothing to hold her on, Jane. Miss Marple paused, then gently asked, Did you retrieve the bottle from the vicarage? The one Perry mentioned, the one Dora used? Craddock nodded. I sent Constable Barrett to collect it an hour ago. Should have been back by now. The door slammed open. Barrett stood in the doorway, pale, soaked, and visibly shaking. Sir, it's gone. Craddock stood immediately. What do you mean, gone? Barrett's voice cracked. The drawer in the vicar's office was smashed open. Someone got there before me. The bottle, anything connected to it, vanished. Craddock swore under his breath. This wasn't a break-in. This was precise, purposeful. Miss Marple's knitting slipped into her bag. Someone knew we were getting close, Barrett added. And there's more. The vicar's study. There was a small fire. Someone tried to burn papers in the grate. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Perry's sermons? Barrett blinked. Yes, a few partially burned pages. He said they were old, but... She rose, smoothing her skirt. Someone is removing their fingerprints from the past. Craddock frowned. But why risk returning? Dora was already back. Miss Marple moved toward the door. Because they weren't protecting Dora, they were protecting themselves, and perhaps burying a secret she never knew she held. At the vicarage, the scene was grim. The lock on. The drawer was crudely forced, and the papers in the hearth were half charred, their corners curling like dying leaves. Perry stood by the window, dishevelled and distraught. I only left the room for a moment, he said, to make tea. I came. Back and smoke. Just smoke. Miss Marple sifted through the unburned pages, her fingers gentle. She spotted something that hadn't fully caught fire, a small slip of notepaper, corner scorched but intact. It bore neat handwriting, not Perry's, and just 3 lines. She doesn't know. I made sure. If she ever finds out, bury it deep. She held it up for Craddock. Whose handwriting? He asked. Lillian's, she murmured. I saw it on her mother's letters once, years ago. Perry stared. Then she did know? Not everything, Miss Marple said softly. But enough to frighten someone, Craddock growled. And now someone's trying to wipe it all clean. It wasn't just the note that had vanished. The bottle, the tea tray it had once sat on, the old pharmacy box Perry kept in his desk, anything that could connect Dora or Lillian or anyone else to the poisoning, all gone. Miss Marple looked at the scorch marks and turned to Perry. Did you see who? Perry hesitated. I thought I saw a figure crossing the garden when I came back in. Coat, hooded. Could have been anyone. Could have, Craddock repeated grimly. That night, rain deepened into a storm. Thunder rolled over Ashby-under-Lyme, as Craddock returned to the station to find the evidence room in disarray. Not vandalized, but reorganized. The police logbook was missing 2 entries, one for the windmill Miss Marple had taken from the Marston estate, and another for a letter Pomeroy had written the night of the murder, a rambling, emotional mess addressed to Lillian, never sent, gone Craddock. Stared at the blank spaces. Someone has access. Miss Marple called in again, examined the evidence log with pursed lips. Not just access, authority. This isn't the work of a frightened woman. It's someone with confidence, with knowledge. Craddock slammed his hand on the desk. Someone inside the station. Silence. Miss Marple's expression didn't change. There's another possibility. Craddock turned to her. She continued. Someone is attempting not just to erase evidence, but to rewrite it, to turn the case away from its true path. And who would do that? Miss Marple lifted her eyes, calm and resolute. Someone who was never a suspect, someone who's been asking questions since the very beginning, framing the narrative. She stood. We need to question everyone again, not just suspects, witnesses, neighbors, staff, even you, Inspector. He blinked. You think? No, she said gently. But someone does. At that moment, a constable entered, breathless. There's been a break-in at the Marston estate. Craddock and Miss Marple exchanged a glance. Let me guess, she said softly. The study? The estate was a mess of mud and wind. Inside, papers were scattered, drawers emptied, floorboards pried open. Whoever had come searching was desperate and clever. They'd ignored valuables. They'd gone for records. But in their haste, they'd missed something. In the fireplace, just under a scorched newspaper, Miss Marple found a page, handwritten, faded. She examined it in the flickering light. It was an old will, half-finished, unsigned, dated 10 years ago, in it. Mrs. Marston left everything, not to Lillian. Not to Dora, but to Pomeroy. Craddock read it aloud, stunned. She changed it, Miss Marple said, but she never destroyed the old one. She kept it, perhaps out of guilt, or perhaps in case she needed Pomeroy again. Craddock looked at her, but he wasn't even in her life anymore, wasn't he? Miss Marple said quietly. He never left the village. He stayed near Lillian, watched her, protected her in his own way. But he had motive. They all did. She said, but now someone is tampering with truth itself, and that means we're close. Lightning flashed through the window. The storm had reached its peak, and somewhere in Ashby-under-Lyme, the real killer was watching the walls close in, one piece of evidence at a time. It began with a scream. A piercing cry shattered the hush of dawn in Ashby-under-Lyme. It came from the direction of the vicarage, high and panicked, silencing the birds and sending dogs barking through the village. Inspector Craddock and Miss Marple were already up, the former nursing tea at the station, the latter wrapping her shawl tight as she emerged from her boarding house. The scream belonged to Lucy Merriweather. They reached the vicarage within minutes. Lucy stood barefoot in the garden, her dressing gown soaked by dew and rain, face pale with terror. She pointed toward the shed behind the hedges, unable to speak. Craddock pushed open the shed door. There, hanging from the rafters by a fraying cord, swayed the lifeless body of Reverend Perry Cottle. His clerical collar was still buttoned. A stool lay tipped over below him, muddy and split. The air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and something darker. Betrayal. Miss Marple exhaled slowly, her face unreadable. It was staged, she said, before Craddock could speak. He turned to her. Suicide. She shook her head. No. Look at the hands. Craddock examined them. They were folded neatly, the nails clean. Too composed, he muttered. And his shoes, Miss Marple added. Wiped clean, but the soles bone dry. No vicar crosses a garden in this weather without getting muddy. Someone brought him here, post-mortem. Craddock stood abruptly, his face darkening. The killer's making a statement. Miss Marple's voice dropped to a whisper. A warning. The village reeled. News spread like rot through the roots of an old tree. Another death. This time, the man of the cloth. And not just any death. A murder hidden beneath the guise of suicide. Perry's loss cut deeper than Lillian's. He was the soul of the community. If even he could fall, who was safe? Craddock called in the coroner, who confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. The bruising on the vicar's neck didn't match a typical hanging. He'd been strangled elsewhere, and the hanging arranged afterward. The vicarage itself showed no signs of forced entry. But a single footprint, small, narrow, feminine, was found in the garden, leading from the hedges toward the road, then vanishing in the rain. The implications were staggering. Someone he trusted let themselves in. Craddock said later at the station, pacing. They knew where the spare key was. He probably offered them tea. Miss Marple said nothing. She stared out the window, watching the wind pull at the trees. They silenced him. She finally said, "Because he knew something." Craddock rubbed his face. "But what?" "He was devastated by Lillian's death." "Which made him dangerous," she replied softly. "Grief unearths secrets." That evening, as darkness fell once more on Ashby-under-Lyme, Miss Marple found herself returning to a place she'd nearly forgotten, the old St. Cecilia's orphanage, abandoned for years and crumbling on the edge of the forest. She remembered Dora had spent time here as a girl. So had Lillian. So had someone else. The gate groaned as she pushed it open. Inside, the old corridors echoed with ghostly memories. But the place wasn't empty. In the main hall, lit by the pale glow of a lantern, stood Lucy Merriweather. She turned at the sound of footsteps, eyes wide. "Miss Marple," she whispered. "I didn't think... You shouldn't be here alone," Jane said gently. Lucy trembled. "I couldn't sleep. I came here sometimes when I was young, when Mum would scream at Dora, when she'd lock her in her room for hours." Her voice cracked. "Lillian knew. She'd sneak Dora food. And Perry, he looked the other way." Miss Marple approached slowly. "And what did you do, Lucy?" Silence. Then, "Nothing. I was just a child." "No," said Jane. "You watched. And now, someone thinks you saw too much." Lucy's face went white. "Perry was silenced because he began to remember," Miss Marple continued. "The bottle, the sermons, the old will, he was piecing it together." "But I didn't kill him," Lucy cried. Miss Marple's voice was still. "Then, why run to the vicarage after dawn? Why scream?" Lucy's hands clenched. "Because I knew he was in danger. Because the night before someone left a note on our door. Just 5 words, 'The vicar dies next, watch.'" Craddock, who had followed at a distance, stepped from the shadows. "And you didn't report it?" Lucy looked between them, tears forming. "I was afraid. I thought maybe it was a joke, or maybe... I wanted it to be." Miss Marple stepped forward and placed a hand on her arm. "Come," she said. "There's something you need to see." Back at the station, Miss Marple opened the file Craddock had overlooked. The full transcripts from the original Marston inheritance dispute. Decades ago, when Lillian was a child, there had been a case brought by Mrs. Marston's former maid, a woman dismissed after being accused of stealing. In her testimony, she mentioned something curious: a man visiting the estate late at night, meeting with the mistress in secret. She described him as quiet, always with gloves, never seen in daylight. The initials listed in her complaint: W. H. Walter Hensley, a former constable, dismissed for tampering with evidence. Craddock stood, eyes wide. "You think he worked?" "Evidence security at the station for years," Miss Marple said, "until 6 months ago." "And he lived?" Craddock asked. "Next to Dora Merriweather," Jane said, "in the upstairs flat. It took them 30 minutes to arrive. The building was dark. The flat door was ajar. Inside, the walls were covered in newspaper clippings, About Lillian, about Mrs. Marston's estate, about the vicar's sermons. Bottles of chemicals lined a shelf. Notes, timelines and names sprawled across a corkboard like a madman's diary. And in the center, a photo of Dora Merriweather smiling. Walter Hensley was gone. Miss Marple stepped forward and pointed to one. Detail on the board, a photograph of the orphanage, written across it in red pen, where it all began. As they stood there, rain still hammering the roof above, Craddock turned to Jane. "We're not chasing a murderer," he said. "So we're chasing an architect," Miss Marple nodded solemnly. "And he's still building," she whispered. "The next tragedy is already in motion." The clock struck midnight, and in the shadows beyond Ashby-under-Lyme, Walter Hensley smiled, and lit another M.A. quiet drizzle hung over Ashby-under-Lyme, softening the edges of rooftops and muting the village's usual hum. Inside the station, Inspector Craddock stared at the murder board, now crowded with photographs, scribbled notes and lines of red string that wove together like the veins of a dying thing. Miss Marple sat beside him, silent but alert, her eyes distant as if combing through threads deeper than ink and paper. Two victims, Lillian Marston and Reverend Perry Cottle. One threat, a killer unafraid to strike again. Too many suspects, too many motives, and yet no clarity until the sandwiches arrived. It was a trivial thing. Mrs. Willow, the cheerful owner of the village cafe, brought them as she often did. But as she set the tray down and fussed over the tea, she said something that pierced the fog in Jane Marple's mind, like a shard of glass. "I made sure not to put the mustard in yours this time, Inspector. I remembered you don't like it. Just like poor Perry. Always used to ask for extra mayo instead. Funny thing that used to hate mayo growing up." Miss Marple froze. "Did he say why he changed?" she asked, her voice deceptively mild. Mrs. Willow blinked. "He told me once, said it reminded him of someone who used to sneak it into his sandwiches when he was at the orphanage. Some kind of silent comfort, he called it. Poor dear. Such a lovely memory." Miss Marple stood. She didn't speak. She simply turned, left the station and walked briskly toward the Marston estate. Craddock caught up with her near the gate. "What is it?" he asked, breathing heavily. "Mustard," she said cryptically. "Or rather, mayo. Jane, this is hardly the—" Reverend Cottle hated mayonnaise, until someone gave it to him with kindness. A small act easily forgotten. Except kindness has fingerprints. Craddock stared. "You think someone from the orphanage is central to this?" "I think the pattern lies in the habits, the things too small to question." Back at the manor, Miss Marple asked to see Lillian's private study again. Dora Merriweather, her sister, hesitated before unlocking the door. "Still combing through her things?" Dora asked with a forced smile. "Miss," Marple gave her a thin one in return. "Not combing, connecting." Inside the study, the room remained untouched. Letters were stacked neatly. A crystal penholder gleamed beside a pile of correspondence. The faintest scent of lavender lingered, a perfume Lillian favored. But Jane didn't go for the desk. She went for the shelf. She pulled out a thin book, Collected Sermons of the Late Reverend Perry Cottle. A gift edition dated a few years ago. Inside was an inscription, "To Lillian, for the kindness you showed me when I was nothing but a stammering boy in shadows. You saved me. Perry." And beneath it, something odd. A folded page, not from the book itself. Miss Marple slid it out and opened it. It was a hand-drawn map, crude, childlike. It marked the grounds of the Marston estate, but it highlighted an old, sealed-off gardener's shed no one had mentioned before, a hidden place. Craddock ordered the groundskeeper to open it. The shed groaned on rusted hinges. Inside, dust, old tools, and a sealed crate covered with a black cloth. They opened it together. Inside were personal belongings, letters, sketches, dried flowers, toys, neatly preserved in dozens of envelopes, labeled with names. Miss Marple read the labels aloud. Dora, Lillian, Perry, Lucy, Walter. "Wait, Walter?" Craddock said sharply. Miss Marple nodded. "Walter Hensley, the ex-constable. We assumed he was the architect of this madness. But look," He's listed like all the others. They opened Walter's envelope. Inside was a photograph. 5 children sitting in a row outside the orphanage, arms linked. Lillian at the center, Perry beside her, Walter to the far left. A younger Dora hugging her knees on the right. And in the middle, a 6th name scribbled faintly in pencil on the back, Mary Abigail Cottle. Mary Abigail Cottle, Craddock repeated later in disbelief. Perry's sister, half-sister, Miss Marple clarified, from a brief liaison their father had with a housemaid. Unacknowledged publicly, but Perry kept in touch. She was placed in the same orphanage. And we've never heard of her? Because she changed her name. Jane flipped through the registry archives they'd brought from town. She took her stepfather's name after adoption. She tapped a page, Mary A. Merriweather. Craddock stared at the name, pale. Lucy's mother. Miss Marple nodded. Which means Lucy isn't Dora's niece. She's her half-sister's daughter, and more importantly, Lillian's cousin. A blood relative, eligible for inheritance under the Marston Trust if the original will is found. Craddock cursed under his breath. That's why the vicar died. He found the truth, that Lucy had a claim no one knew about. And more. Than that, Miss Marple said, voice low. He found who knew from the beginning and tried to erase it. The pattern clicked into place. Lillian discovered the truth about Lucy's lineage. She decided to rewrite her will, perhaps out of guilt or kindness. That decision threatened someone who'd built their life around inheriting everything. Dora, she, was the only one who had both motive and access. She'd grown up alongside Perry, Lillian, Walter, and Mary. She knew the old connections, the hidden places, the childhood loyalties. She likely forged the anonymous letters to frighten Lucy into silence, and she killed Lillian to stop the will. Perry had begun to see through the lie, so she killed him too. But something had gone wrong. Perhaps guilt, perhaps fear, or perhaps Lucy. That evening, Miss Marple visited Lucy at her home. I need to ask you something, she said gently. Did your mother ever talk about Lillian? Lucy nodded slowly. She said Lillian used to visit the orphanage, that she was kind. She helped Mum escape one night, gave her money, said she deserved better. Your mother kept a box of keepsakes, didn't she? Lucy blinked. Yes, I buried it, after she died. In the woods. I think it's time we unearthed it. The box, when found, contained proof. A letter from Lillian promising to help Mary claim her inheritance. A locket with a photo of Mary and Lillian together, and, most damning, a confession from Mary herself, expressing her desire that Lucy one day receive what she was owed. Craddock filed it as evidence. Dora Merriweather was arrested that night. She said nothing as she was taken away. But Miss Marple noted the way she looked at Lucy, eyes full of something ancient and twisted, not hatred, regret. As Miss Marple sat by her window that night, knitting half-forgotten stitches into a growing shawl, she whispered into the silence. It was always in plain sight. The child with too many secrets. The cousin with no name. A jar of mayonnaise, a sermon about salvation. The rain had stopped, but the echoes lingered. The pattern had emerged, and it was made of broken hearts. Ashby-under-Lyme was quiet again, but it was the stillness that comes after a storm, where silence feels heavier, like the earth itself is holding its breath. Inspector Craddock stood outside the station's interview room, arms folded, eyes narrowed. Inside sat Dora Merriweather, her hair pinned tight, her blouse spotless, her expression blank. She hadn't said a word since her arrest the night before. Across the room sat Miss Marple, calm as ever, her knitting in her lap, but untouched. Craddock exhaled. She's not going to talk. Miss Marple didn't look up. She will, but not for you. You think she'll confess to you? I think, Jane said, finally meeting his eyes, that she's waited her entire life to explain herself. Just not to a man with a badge. Dora finally spoke when the door closed behind Craddock and they were alone. I didn't mean for it to happen like this. Miss Marple said nothing. Dora smiled bitterly. Of course. The wise old woman act. You're just waiting for me to fall apart. I'm waiting for the truth, Jane replied gently, which I believe has been buried for decades. Dora's hand twitched on the table. You always see things others don't. Always did. I remember you from when I was a girl. Always. Watching. And I remember you, said Miss Marple softly. A clever child. Quiet. Overlooked. But always listening. Dora leaned forward. She was going to give it all to Lucy, all of it, after everything I did. After everything she took. She? My mother, Dora hissed. The woman no one remembers in this story. Miss Marple didn't blink. Mary Abigail Cottle. Dora gave a sharp nod. She abandoned me. Left me in that awful orphanage while she went gallivanting about. Then she comes back, pregnant, and expects my father to take her in. Of course, he didn't. Why would he? She was a mistake, and so was Lucy, a bastard child raised in pity. You and Mary were half-sisters, Jane reminded her. Lillian tried to help both of you. She patted my head and handed me books, Dora spat. But Mary she rescued. She paid her way out of the orphanage, found her work, introduced her to rich friends. And when Mary died, drowned in that lake, Lillian cried like she'd lost her daughter. I was standing right there, and she didn't shed a tear for me. Miss Marple was silent for a long time. And so, she said at last, you decided to take what you felt you were owed. Dora's voice turned cold. I earned it. I stayed. I served. I cleaned up after her. I kept the estate afloat when Lillian was off playing charity queen. I listened to her cry over everyone else. She never saw me. Until she discovered Lucy's true parentage, Jane said. Yes, Dora whispered. That was when she remembered me. She told me she'd be changing the will. She said Lucy was the future of the family. But Lucy didn't want it. She didn't even know. She didn't care. And still, she would inherit. I begged her not to do it, but she wouldn't listen. She looked at me with those same eyes Mother used to give me, like I was a broken tool. Like I wasn't real. Dora's hands clenched into fists. So I waited until she was asleep, and I ended it, quick, quiet, like slipping away into a dream. And Perry? Miss Marple asked, voice faint. Dora's lip trembled. He figured it out. He came to me, said he wouldn't keep quiet. I told him it wasn't about money. He said it didn't matter, that it was wrong. You killed him to protect yourself. No, Dora said, shaking her head. I killed him because he was grateful to her. He thanked her in his sermons. He praised her kindness. He never saw the cruelty under it. None of them did. Miss Marple folded her hands. You thought no one ever saw you. Dora's eyes were wet now. I still don't think they do. Later that evening, Craddock and Miss Marple sat by the fireplace at the vicarage, the fire crackling softly as a storm gathered outside. So that's it, Craddock muttered. Not money, not power, just envy. No, Jane said, sipping her tea. Not envy. Neglect. Dora didn't want riches. She wanted recognition. She lived in Lillian's shadow. Her mother abandoned her. Her father ignored her. And Lillian, who should have known better, treated her like a servant. But it wasn't deliberate, Craddock said. That, said Miss Marple, is often the tragedy. Craddock stared into the fire. I thought murderers were made of something else, that they were monsters. They're not, Jane said. They're people who carry wounds too long, and sometimes those wounds start cutting others. Lucy came by the next morning, eyes rimmed red. She left this for me, she said, handing Miss Marple a sealed envelope. One of the officers found it in the study drawer, labelled with my name. Inside was a single page handwritten in trembling lines. Lucy, you remind me of her. You smile like she did, you dream like she did, and I hated you for it. But you never asked for this, you never claimed it, and that's what made you different. I hope you never feel as invisible as I did. Dora Lucy looked down. She hated me. She hated what she never had, Miss Marple corrected gently. You were just the reflection of it. As Lucy left, the clouds parted briefly above Ashby-under-Lyme. A ray of sun pierced through, lighting the garden where the first leaves of autumn had begun to fall. Inside the vicarage, Miss Marple returned to her chair, the fire now dimmed to embers. People always think the motive is greed, she murmured to herself, but more often it's grief. And she picked up her knitting again, weaving threads. just as she had done with lives, lies, and shadows, quietly, completely, until the pattern made sense. The air in Ashby-under-Lyme crackled with the anticipation of a storm, not a weather-bound one, but something tighter, darker, more human. A silence had settled over the village, the kind of silence that often came before truths were revealed. Inspector Craddock paced the edge of the drawing room at Ashcroft Manor. The house, once echoing with the stately pride of Lillian Ashcroft's presence, now felt hollow, as though the walls themselves were recoiling from what had happened. Miss Marple sat near the fireplace, her hands folded gently in her lap. But her eyes, sharp, unwavering, were fixed on the door. She had asked for one last meeting, one final gathering of the players in this tangled drama. They arrived, one by one. Lucy Harrington, pale but resolute, her chin held high. Reverend Thomas, still grieving for Perry, his hands folded tightly in front of him. Mr. Bannister, the solicitor, with his polished shoes and eyes that darted nervously. And finally, Dora Merriweather, escorted in handcuffs by 2 uniformed constables. Craddock gave Miss Marple a questioning glance. She nodded once. The final act had begun. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began, her voice steady. For no, this is most unusual, but clarity in the end must always win out over comfort." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "We've already got a confession. Dora admitted to the murder of both Lillian and Perry." Miss Marple gave him a faint smile. "She did, but I believe she only told part of the truth." Dora stiffened in her seat. Craddock turned. "Is this true, Miss Merriweather?" Dora said nothing. Jane continued. "Dora believed she was acting alone, driven by long-festering pain and resentment. But there's a second thread woven into this tapestry, one that only became visible when I reread Perry's final sermon notes." Craddock frowned. "I thought they were just full of biblical metaphors." "They were, but he made reference to a serpent in the garden more than once. A silver tongue that leads hearts astray." Miss Marple turned to Lucy. "You received a letter from Dora. In it she admitted her hatred, but she never once mentioned Perry." Lucy blinked. "That's true. Because she didn't." "Kill him." The room shifted. Craddock straightened. "Miss Marple, she confessed she believed she killed him," Jane said calmly. "She struck him during an argument, yes, but the coroner's report showed the death wasn't immediate. There was a second trauma, a poison administered later." Craddock's eyes widened. "But we didn't find any poison in Dora's possession." Jane turned toward Reverend Thomas. "You found Perry after he collapsed, didn't you, Vicar?" Thomas paled. "You claimed you called the doctor, but no call was logged from the vicarage that night. Instead, Perry lay there, unconscious, vulnerable. And that's when you finished what Dora began." "No," Thomas whispered. "That's not—" Jane's voice remained calm. "You knew what he'd discovered, that Lillian had planned to change her will, that Lucy wasn't just her ward, but her granddaughter, that the estate would bypass the church's influence entirely." Thomas stood abruptly. "That's nonsense. You encouraged Perry to investigate, didn't you? Urged him to look into the old records, the baptismal ledgers, the orphanage files, and when he came to you with the truth, you panicked." Thomas turned to Craddock. "She's speculating. This is character assassination." Miss Marple gestured to Mr. Bannister. "Tell them what you told me." The solicitor looked cornered. "Perry visited me the day before he died. He asked about Lillian's revised will, said he had reason to believe someone was manipulating her finances, someone close to the church." Thomas's face turned red. "Perry had the will," Jane said. "He took it from Bannister's office, after hours. That's why it was missing from Lillian's safe. He wanted to confront you." Thomas was trembling now. Miss Marple took a step forward. "You were a man of the cloth, yes, but you'd grown used to influence. Lillian funded the parish school, the repairs to the vestry, the new roof, and with Lucy inheriting, you feared that support would disappear." "She was going to ruin us," Thomas snapped. "Everything Lillian built would go to waste under." That child," Lucy flinched. Miss Marple's voice was soft. "So you waited, let Dora believe she had done it all. You administered the poison quietly, carefully, then staged the scene. Craddock stepped forward. "Do you deny administering poison, Reverend?" Thomas swallowed, his eyes darting between them all. "I did what I had to do," he said at last. "For the community." He lunged toward Lucy, but Craddock was faster. In moments Thomas was restrained, his wrists locked in iron. His face was slack with defeat. Later, as the sun dipped behind the Ashcroft woods, casting long golden shadows, across the estate, Miss Marple and Craddock stood on the garden path. "So," Craddock said, "two murderers, one acting from pain, one from fear." Miss Marple nodded. "It's not always a matter of good and evil, Inspector. Sometimes it's simply desperation wearing two masks." He looked at her, his voice quiet. "How did you know?" "I didn't," she said. "Not at first. But Dora's confession was too clean. And Thomas, he had been too composed, too ready with his grief. And Perry was too careful a man to die without leaving a trail." They walked, in silence for a moment. "You always see things I don't," Craddock said. Miss Marple smiled just a little. "Only because I've spent more time watching people than chasing them. The house would eventually be sold. Lucy, now the rightful heir, had no desire to remain there. Dora would serve her sentence, though her role in Perry's death was reconsidered with sympathy. And Thomas, stripped of his collar and position, would fade into infamy. Ashby-under-Lyme would move on, as villages do. But for those who had lived through the long shadow of murder and memory, things would never be quite the same. Justice had been served, but the scar would remain. Ashby-under-Lyme was quiet again. The kind of quiet that came after thunder. The investigation was closed. Reverend Thomas had been arrested for Perry's poisoning. Dora Merriweather had confessed to striking the curate, and Lucy Harrington, now revealed as Lillian Ashcroft's granddaughter, had inherited the estate. Inspector Craddock was already packing up his notes, half thinking about a few days of rest. And Miss Marple, dear sharp Miss Marple, had returned to her knitting by the garden window, apparently content. But Craddock couldn't relax. Not fully. A certain comment Miss Marple had made during the final confrontation kept echoing in his mind. Perry was too careful a man to die without leaving a trail. Why then had they found no journal? No last sermon? No hidden letter in the vicarage? Perry had uncovered the truth. He had risked everything to expose it. Yet the only evidence had come from others, never from Perry himself. The inspector returned to the vicarage alone and requested one more look through the study. It had already been swept twice. But now he walked the room slowly, hand brushing along the old desk, the window ledge, the back of a shelf, until he paused. There, in the corner, behind the bookcase, was a thin sliver of plaster that looked different, less weathered. He knocked. Hollow. With a borrowed screwdriver and a little force, the false panel gave way. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, brittle with age. Craddock opened it, and the truth once again changed. Hours later, Miss Marple set down her tea, peering up as Craddock returned. "You found something," she said simply. Craddock sat, laying the notebook between them. It was hidden behind a panel. Perry's final journal. His real one. Jane's hands moved gently over the worn cover, as if feeling for something beyond the words. "He recorded everything," Craddock said. "Not just about Thomas, but about Lucy." Miss Marple's brow furrowed faintly. Craddock continued. "He discovered Lucy wasn't Lillian's granddaughter. She was her great-niece. Lillian's actual granddaughter had died in infancy. Lucy's identity was fabricated, her papers altered with help from someone inside the orphanage records office. Someone with legal expertise," Miss Marple whispered. "Bannister." Craddock nodded. Exactly. Bannister had quietly shifted her identity years ago, at Lillian's request. But Perry found inconsistencies, and he believed Lucy had discovered the truth herself, that she had quietly maneuvered to keep the deception hidden. Jane looked out the window, her knitting forgotten. She was always calm, she murmured, even when facing ruin, too calm. She had motive to remove Lillian before the new will could be signed, Craddock said. Motive to push Dora, gently, toward violence. Perry believed she manipulated everyone around her, including Thomas. Miss Marple's voice was suddenly cold. She used Dora's rage, Thomas's ambition, Perry's conscience. She knew Thomas was watching Perry closely. She knew Dora was unstable. She just nudged the pieces into place and let the others do the dirty work. Craddock opened the last page of the journal. Perry wrote, "She smiled when I told her about the baptism ledger. Not surprised, not shocked. She already knew. But I was the fool who told her I had evidence. She told me to rest, that the truth would keep. I believe I won't wake tomorrow." Miss Marple closed the book gently. She poisoned him herself. Craddock nodded grimly. She added the final dose while pretending to nurse him. The earlier blow from Dora was real, the stress on his heart real. But the poison finished it. And she let Thomas take the blame, because he had a motive and a prior lie. Silence sat heavily between them. "And now?" Miss Marple asked softly. "She's already packed her things," Craddock said. "I believe she meant to vanish. By morning. New name, new life, but she doesn't know about the journal, not yet." Jane stood. "Then let's pay her one final visit." Lucy Harrington sat in the Ashcroft Manor drawing-room, calm and elegant as ever. A single valise rested by the door. Her expression didn't flicker when Miss Marple and Craddock entered. "I was just about to leave," she said. "We know," Craddock replied. Miss Marple stepped forward and placed the journal on the table. "I'm afraid Perry left something behind after all." Lucy's eyes lingered on the cover for only a second, but in that second Miss Marple saw it, the subtle shift of her breathing, the tensing of her hand. "I don't know what that is," Lucy said. "You do," Craddock said, "and he wrote everything, including how you smiled when he mentioned the baptismal error. How you already knew." "I was being kind," Lucy said smoothly. "Perry was clearly unwell." "You weren't Lillian's granddaughter," Miss Marple said quietly. "You were her niece's daughter. Illegitimate, raised in the same orphanage, where your real records were altered by Bannister. At Lillian's request, she owed your mother something.